On a warm Friday afternoon, the intersection of Oak and King Streets in downtown Riverstone was alive with the buzz of city life. Vendors called out to passers-by, cars honked impatiently in the congested traffic, and a cool breeze carried the aroma of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe. Amidst the urban bustle sat Sergeant Jacob Anderson in his patrol car, sipping the remnants of his now tepid coffee. Anderson, a seasoned officer with over a decade on the force, was known for his fiery temper and authoritarian demeanor. To him, the badge he wore wasn't a symbol of service but an emblem of power. Across the street, a man stepped out of the coffee shop. He was tall, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, and carried himself with quiet confidence. David Carter, a Riverstone native who had spent years working in another city, had recently returned to his hometown for a significant reason. Unknown to Anderson, David had been appointed as the new captain of the precinct where Anderson served. This fact, however, would remain hidden until it was too late. David's calm demeanor and purposeful stride caught Anderson's eye. The officer's face hardened as he watched David walk confidently toward the crosswalk. Years of ingrained prejudice bubbled to the surface. A black man in a suit? What's he up to? Anderson thought, suspicion narrowing his gaze. They always act like they belong, but they don't fool me. Unable to contain his irritation, Anderson slammed his coffee into the cup holder and stepped out of his patrol car. The door closed with a loud thud, catching the attention of a few pedestrians nearby. Adjusting his belt, Anderson began walking briskly toward David, his boots striking the pavement with authority. "Hey, you!" Anderson barked, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the street. "What are you doing around here?" David stopped mid-step, turning to face the officer. His expression remained calm, though a flicker of surprise crossed his features. "Good afternoon, officer," he replied, his tone respectful but firm. "I'm on my way to a meeting." Anderson's eyes scanned David from head to toe, searching for any sign of wrongdoing. "A meeting, huh?" he sneered. "What kind of meeting? Got any ID?" David nodded politely, reaching into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness. "Of course, I'll show you my identification," he said evenly, hoping to diffuse the tension. But Anderson's thoughts had already spiraled. Too calm, too collected. "He's playing me," the officer thought. His grip on authority tightened, fueled by a toxic combination of bias and paranoia. "Don't bother," Anderson snapped, stepping closer and grabbing David's arm roughly. "You think you're smart, huh? Acting all polite, trying to fool me?" "Officer, there's no need for this," David said, his voice remaining composed but firm. "You're making a mistake." Anderson's temper flared. In a moment of uncontrolled rage, he lashed out, his fist connecting squarely with David's face. The force of the punch echoed loudly, silencing the busy street momentarily. David stumbled backwards, his polished shoes scraping against the pavement, but he managed to stay upright. Around them, pedestrians froze in shock, their phones raised to capture the unfolding incident. David straightened, his hand brushing the spot on his cheek where Anderson's fist had landed. His calm demeanor had shifted into one of resolute authority. His gaze locked onto Anderson, steady and unwavering, as if piercing through the officer's facade of power. "Sergeant Anderson," David said, his voice steady and commanding, "you have just assaulted a superior officer." Anderson's confidence faltered, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "What?" he stammered, his fists still clenched. "What did you just say?" David reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out his badge. He held it up for Anderson and the onlookers to see. "I am David Carter, the new captain of this precinct, and you, Sergeant, have made a grave mistake." The color drained from Anderson's face as his world began to spin. His mind raced, but every justification he could conjure crumbled under the weight of reality. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, the collective disbelief palpable. Still, Anderson clung to his delusions. "You're lying," he spat, though his voice wavered. "You're just trying to trick me." David's voice remained calm, though it carried an edge of finality. "Do you think I would joke about something like this? Your actions today were not driven by duty, but by bias, and now you will face the consequences. Stay right there, Anderson bellowed, attempting to regain control of the situation. His hand darted to his belt as he retrieved his handcuffs. Before David could react, Anderson grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. You're under arrest. David's jaw tightened as Anderson snapped the cuffs around his wrists, though his face betrayed no fear, only disappointment. As the murmurs of the crowd turned into loud whispers and gasps, Anderson turned to address the bystanders. This man is nothing but a criminal, Anderson shouted, his voice dripping with misplaced authority. He was about to cause trouble here, but I stopped him just in time. The crowd, now larger, began to stir. A woman near the front frowned deeply, her phone still recording. Are you sure about that, officer? He doesn't look like he was doing anything wrong. Mind your business, Anderson snapped, his tone sharp and defensive. I'm the law here, and I know what I'm doing. David took a deep breath, turning his gaze toward the concerned bystanders. Please, he said, his voice steady but louder now. Listen to me. I am not a criminal. My name is David Carter, and I am the newly appointed captain of this precinct. Record everything you see and don't delete it. Anderson scoffed, his face twisting into a sneer. Captain? Ha! That's the best lie you've come up with? You must think I'm stupid. He gestured toward his radio and barked into it. I need backup at Oak and King. I've apprehended a suspect. Send units immediately. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as doubts began to spread. Some took cautious steps forward, questioning the officer's behavior. A few people called out, Are you sure you've got the right guy? Others simply stood in stunned silence, their cameras capturing every second of the unfolding drama. David turned his head slightly to a young man recording nearby. Please don't stop filming, he said quietly, his voice firm. This needs to be seen. Minutes later, the wail of sirens broke through the tension as two squad cars pulled up. From one of them emerged Lieutenant Maria Reynolds, a respected veteran known for her no-nonsense approach and fairness. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in David in handcuffs, Anderson's flushed face, and the murmuring crowd. What's going on here? Reynolds demanded, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Anderson quickly approached her, his posture stiff with self-assurance. I've apprehended a suspect acting suspiciously, he said, gesturing toward David. He refused to cooperate, so I had to take action. Reynolds' gaze shifted to David, her eyes narrowing as recognition dawned. Suspect? She repeated slowly. That's Captain David Carter, our new precinct leader. Anderson froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. What? No, that can't be. Reynolds didn't wait for him to finish. She stepped forward and removed the cuffs from David's wrists, her expression tight with anger. Captain Carter, are you all right? David nodded, rubbing his wrists. I'll be fine, but this, he gestured toward Anderson. This behavior is unacceptable. Reynolds turned to Anderson, her voice cold. Sergeant Anderson, you've overstepped your bounds. You assaulted a superior officer and falsely accused him. This will not be ignored. The weight of her words crashed down on Anderson as the crowd erupted into murmurs and slowly applause. Anderson's knees felt weak as shame and regret finally pierced through his defenses. He had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. After Anderson was taken back to the police station, David Carter returned to his office, the room quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. His cheeks still bore the faint redness of Anderson's punch, a reminder of how close things had come to spiraling further out of control. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Come in, David said, his voice steady. Reynolds entered, her expression a mix of respect and concern. Captain Carter, she began, closing the door behind her. How are you holding up? David leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. I'm fine, Lieutenant. I've dealt with worse. But this, he gestured to his face. This wasn't just about me. It's about everything Anderson represents. Prejudice, abuse of power. It's a systemic issue, and today it boiled over. Reynolds nodded solemnly. I agree, sir. But what do you want to do about him? The department is waiting for your decision. David tapped his fingers on the desk, his gaze distant. Anderson needs to be held accountable, but I want this to be a turning point. For him, for the precinct, for everyone watching. This isn't just about punishment, it's about change. Later that evening, Anderson sat alone in his holding cell. The cold metal of the bench beneath him felt like a fitting reflection of his situation. For the first time, he was on the other side of the law he had sworn to uphold. As the hours passed, the weight of his actions became unbearable. Memories of his career flooded his mind, moments when he had let his temper or biases dictate his decisions. He realized how many times he had looked the other way when others acted similarly. He had thought of himself as untouchable, but now his own arrogance had brought him to this point. The reality of his situation had begun to sink in. Hours ago, he had felt untouchable, convinced of his own righteousness and authority. Now, stripped of his badge and gun, he felt exposed, small, and powerless. The distant hum of activity in the precinct was interrupted by the sound of deliberate footsteps echoing down the hall. Anderson looked up to see David Carter, flanked by Lieutenant Reynolds. David's expression was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of disappointment and resolve. "Open the door," David said, his voice firm. Reynolds complied, unlocking the cell and stepping aside as David entered. The clang of the door closing behind him reverberated through the silence. Anderson straightened slightly, his pride refusing to let him appear weak, though his trembling hands betrayed him. "Captain Carter," he began, his voice hoarse. I didn't know." David held up a hand, cutting him off. "That's precisely the problem, Sergeant. You didn't know, yet you acted. You let your prejudice dictate your actions, and now you're facing the consequences." Anderson opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. For years, he had operated under the belief that his instincts were infallible, that his authority was unquestionable. But now, confronted with the gravity of his actions, he felt the fragile foundation of his worldview cracking beneath him. David stepped closer, his tone measured but unyielding. "Do you know what it's like, Anderson? To walk through life knowing that people like you see me as a threat, as a criminal, simply because of the color of my skin? To be judged, mistreated, and attacked, not for what I've done, but for who I am." Anderson looked away, shame burning his cheeks. "I didn't mean to." David's voice hardened. "You didn't mean to. You punched me in the face. You called me a criminal. You humiliated me in front of a crowd. And you did all of it because in your mind, a black man in a suit couldn't possibly be anything but a con artist or worse." Anderson's head sank lower. He began, but his voice faltered. "This isn't just about me," David continued, his voice rising slightly. "This is about every black man, woman, and child who has been mistreated by people like you. People who let their biases cloud their judgment. People who abuse the power they've been given instead of using it to protect and serve." Anderson looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and desperation. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. David straightened, his gaze unwavering. "Now you face accountability. You'll go before an internal review board. Your actions will be investigated and the appropriate consequences will follow. But this isn't just about punishment, Anderson. It's about change." "Change?" Anderson asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "Yes," David replied. "You have a choice. You can let this be the end of your career, or you can use this as an opportunity to confront your biases, to reflect on your actions, and to become better. The decision is yours." Anderson's throat tightened. He wanted to protest, to defend his pride, but deep down he knew this was more than he deserved. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes." David's expression softened slightly, though his resolve remained. "Good. But understand this. Change isn't easy. It requires humility, effort, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. If you're not prepared for that, then this will mean nothing." In the weeks that followed, Anderson was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. During that time, David implemented sweeping reforms within the precinct, mandatory bias training sessions were introduced, and officers were required to participate in community outreach programs designed to build trust and understanding. David also held a town hall meeting, inviting members of the community to voice their concerns and share their experiences with law enforcement. The room was packed, the atmosphere charged with a mix of anger, hope, and determination. Standing at the podium, David addressed the crowd with calm authority. "What happened on Oak and King was unacceptable," he began. "It was a failure of judgment, a failure of leadership, and a failure of the system that allowed such behavior to persist. But this is not where the story ends." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We have the power to create change, not just within this precinct, but within our entire community. It starts with accountability, with listening, and with taking action. It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight. But I believe in this community. I believe in our ability to come together, to stand up for what is right, and to build a future that is fair, just, and equitable for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, their clapping a powerful affirmation of David's words. For the first time in years, hope began to take root in the hearts of those who had long felt unheard. Months later, Anderson returned to the precinct under close supervision. The investigation had concluded, and while he retained his position, he was placed on probation and required to complete extensive training. Though many of his colleagues kept their distance, Anderson threw himself into the work, determined to prove that he could change. He attended every training session, listened to community members share their stories, and volunteered for outreach programs. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild the trust he had lost. Though the journey was far from over, Anderson knew that he was moving in the right direction. As for David, he continued to lead the precinct with courage and integrity. Under his guidance, the precinct became a model for reform, a beacon of hope for other communities grappling with similar issues. One evening, as David walked through the precinct, he saw Anderson working late, his desk covered in case files. Their eyes met, and Anderson offered a small, tentative nod. David nodded back, a faint smile on his lips. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. And in that moment, both men knew they were on the path to something better. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.